Hey, IB History Scholars, it's Mr. Newcomb again here. In this session, I'll focus on part two of the civil rights movement and zero in more on the role of the federal government. Looking at the executive branch, it comes down to, does the president have the political will to take on this issue? Uh, Truman and Johnson are probably going to be the two that will have more political will than Eisenhower and Kennedy. Truman establishes the Civil Rights Commission and they come out with a document called "To Secure These Rights," which sets the tone, sets the blueprint, sets the objectives that need to be accomplished in order for civil rights to be had. And so now, over the next several decades, they'll slowly work at accomplishing some of those items, but it's still rather incomplete, one could say, by today. In 1948, President Harry Truman signs the Executive Order 9981, and that desegregates the armed forces. And so in 1950, we'll go off to Korea and we'll fight with a more integrated armed forces in that conflict. President Eisenhower takes over for Truman in 1953, and one of his early appointees to the U.S. Supreme Court is Earl Warren, and he becomes the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice. Earl Warren, his Supreme Court will actually become a very active court. They engage in judicial activism, and through the court, they're going to make some big changes. Eisenhower perhaps did not anticipate that, since he was more of a moderate and sometimes has been quoted as or referenced as he didn't necessarily think he made a good appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court with Earl Warren. In many cases, it's going to force Eisenhower to get actively involved in civil rights, which he was hesitant to do it. Eisenhower will use federal troops to enforce the federal court order integrating Little Rock Central High School. This makes reference to the Little Rock Nine, where he federalizes the National Guard in Arkansas, and he sends in the paratroopers as well. Kennedy used federal marshals and troops to enforce the enrollment of James Meredith in the University of Mississippi, as well as instructs Attorney General Robert Kennedy to issue a ruling requiring the Interstate Commerce Commission to end desegregation or end discrimination in interstate travel. But Kennedy is, like Eisenhower, is using federal authority in a more reactive way than in a proactive way, where you can see Truman is becoming more proactive. And then Lyndon Johnson, a combination of reaction and being proactive here as well. Lyndon Johnson was very supportive, one could argue, for civil rights, and you can see huge legislation happen under his watch here. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act dealing with public accommodations, 1965 Voting Rights Act that dealt with voting, and the 24th Amendment that got rid of the poll tax, which was focusing on voting. One thing, though, we look at Lyndon Johnson in that his civil rights legislation, in many cases, could be compromised, or in some ways, Lyndon Johnson, he wants to focus on his Great Society programs and his war on poverty in Vietnam, and civil rights gets caught in there as well. So, in terms of the judicial branch here, you can see that some key Supreme Court decisions happen and to strike down some segregation measures here. And these measures have been mentioned in the previous session, part 1, in regards to some key moments here. The U.S. Supreme Court does become very active in promoting civil rights. In 1954, it struck down Plessy versus Ferguson when it ruled Brown versus Board of Education that ordered the desegregation of public schools. In 1955, it had a follow-up with a Brown 2, which said that dual public education systems must end. Simply after the first Brown versus Board of Education, you found in the South dual systems still being popped up and segregation still going on. And in 1965, in a response to the Montgomery bus boycott, the Supreme Court ruling in Browder versus Gale ended Alabama's segregation of the buses. All right, and so in regards to the legislative branch, a flurry of legislation is going to happen, though primarily in the 1960s, though, as a result of the popular protests that was initiated by groups like the NAACP and CORE and SNCC and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 1957, the Civil Rights Act was passed, created the Civil Rights Commission as an attempt to prevent obstruction to voting rights. Still continued, so stronger enforcement needs to happen. So in 1960, you get the enforcement powers of the 1957 Act. It still continued, and so you get the 1965 Voting Rights Act passed and the 24th Amendment, the poll tax getting outlawed. That those become laws. 1964, you had the Civil Rights Act on public accommodations, more federal enforcement there, and then 1968 Civil Rights Act was trying to deal with housing. What you have here is the federal government getting actively involved. In order for success to happen, 2 of the 3 need to be working at the same time on the issue. If only one was going to deal with the issue, it's not going to have far-reaching effects. So 2 of the 3 branches need to be actively working towards this. Political will has to be definitely in there, and you're starting to see that there is some political will happening. The Democratic Party is taking more of an active role here. Southern conservative Democrats are leaving the Democratic Party. They're either forming their own that becomes known as like the Dixiecrats here, or they are merging with the Republican Party and becoming more conservative here. All right, this is the end of part 2, and so in a moment here, part 3 will be happening.